podcast.
Thanks.
I have to say, before I read your book, I listened to your interview, your appearance on your husband's podcast.
Right.
And it's so funny because he says, "Welcome to the podcast," and then you just start giggling.
Right.
And then he says, "So Annaka,
You probably remember it better than I do.
tell me about the book." And then you just go, "Really? Like that's the question you're going to ask?" And I just immediately felt like, "Oh, I'm all in on Annaka." That was like, you're just like taking the piss out of him. I thought that was fantastic.
Right, thanks.
I'm glad
you saw it that way.
Yeah. And I love the book. Congratulations on it, making the New York
you.
Times bestseller list. That's very cool.
Thanks.
And I'm excited to talk to you. This is a fascinating subject.
Yeah, I think so.
A subject, the more that you think about it, the more sort of amazing and wonderful and mystifying it becomes, right?
Yeah.
So before we kind of delve into consciousness, why don't we contextualize this a little bit?
Yeah,
like, how did you
sure.
get interested in this field?
I just wanted to ask you, though, is this something you were interested in before you read my book, or have you been thinking about it since reading it?
Well,
I asked just because there's kind of the category of people who have just been fascinated with it always, and then everyone seems to become fascinated with it once they learn a little, but
it's impossible to
curious.
not be fascinated by it once you start to learn a little bit about it.
Right.
I would say that I have an interest in it that is longstanding, although I don't know that it rose to the level of
obsession like mine.
Yeah, it's not that.
Right.
But through my journeys in addiction recovery, and then being introduced to meditation and yoga and various spiritual practices, it's certainly become more and more interesting to me.
Yeah. So actually, I became interested in meditation, I think, mostly because of my fascination with consciousness, but they're obviously related. So as I said, it was a lifelong fascination. It's something I've just always been interested in and as I got older, read a lot about. And then for the last almost 15 years, I've been working with scientists who write for the general public. I've been doing mostly editing, but some coaching for TED Talks and things like that. And so I got actually deeper into the neuroscience, and I basically have just because of my own interest, been taking notes all of this time for myself. Yeah. And maybe like 2.5 years ago, I started really formally writing, not really for any purpose except to think through my own thoughts because I was interested. And I felt like the topic is so complex, I needed to do some writing just to sort out for myself where I was with all of it and what I thought could be true. But my book is really the science and philosophy of consciousness, and I tried to make it as accessible as possible, which was really the main goal. And I'm focused on kind of consciousness, what the most fundamental aspect, or consciousness in the most fundamental sense, and why it's so deeply mysterious, why it's so difficult for neuroscientists to study it, why it just always has been perplexing to scientists. So I walk the reader through what I think are some of the most interesting theories and research in consciousness studies, but this is all kind of in the context of challenging our intuitions about what consciousness is.
Yeah, it's less about drawing any specific conclusions rather than it is about let's confront what we think it is and deconstruct that a little bit to make us realize that it's so much more complex and vast and confounding than we might
awe-inspiring
imagine.
and one of the great mysteries. So I kind of, part of me just wanted to spread that, the idea that this is one of the great mysteries. And if you haven't discovered it yet, it's like, it's as fun to contemplate as, the idea of black holes or the beginning of the universe or, all of the things that we pretty easily understand are great mysteries and interesting to contemplate.
Right, from black holes all the way down to particle physics.
Right,
basically.
Yeah. And that this actually fits in with some of the mysteries that pop up there as well. So challenging intuitions is something that I think is incredibly interesting, and it's a very important part of the scientific process, which I think most people know, but they don't really think about or realize. That every time we make a scientific breakthrough or understand reality at a more fundamental level or reach a deeper truth about the nature of reality, that always requires that we challenge our intuitions at the very least. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we have to completely let go of intuitions that are actually giving us false information about reality. So this is true in everything from understanding that the Earth is a sphere and not flat, as our senses lead us to believe. And this actually took a lot of science to get enough information to realize that our intuitions were wrong. There were celestial observations that convinced people over a long period of time, because it's so counterintuitive. It's actually hard for people to get their minds around.
Once the science is hard and fast, there's still an extraordinarily long lag period before people will still adopt it.
Yes, and that's true for scientists. It's kind of like the scientists come first, but there's always this period of time of wrestling with intuitions before the scientists first are kind of able to accept the evidence that has come in that's counter to our intuitions, and then the public obviously comes a little bit later. But that's, the germ theory of disease is another great example that I like to give, that the idea that microscopic things that we can't interact with or sense at all can kill us, is just something that took people a long time to see enough evidence for that they could accept it.
Scientists priding themselves on their objective lens are still, held prisoner by our own cognitive biases.
Well, absolutely. And it's part of the scientific process. We have to kind of check everything against our intuitions. But it is just this process of checking and saying, no, that can't be right. It feels so wrong. It can't be right. And then you finally get to a point where you start to shift your intuitions, or you learn how to just not trust them in that particular area.
In the case of consciousness, though, I feel like after reading this book, we're barely out of the starting gate.
Yes. So that was why that was one of the main reasons I wrote this book. And really the goal of the book is to shake up our intuitions about consciousness as much as possible, because I think if we're able to make progress, if we're able to, the human brain, I think, is not capable of understanding everything. And so it may just fall into that category. But if we can understand consciousness better, it will require that we really challenge some strong intuitions that we have. And I think we're at that point with regard to consciousness.
I like that you say that the human brain isn't capable of understanding all of these things. I feel like there's a hubristic flair that kind of emanates across the scientific community that we can indeed understand everything. And perhaps that's true at some future point, or with the
I think it's an
advent of
aspirational
robots, but
It's interesting because most science I know, and typically scientists more than other people I know, are much more willing to say they don't know something, or we may never know, or this is deeply mysterious. Physicists in particular, but scientists in general, I think the messaging that comes out, and I would partly fault the media, but I think it's also just a natural circumstance of the messaging. When we learn something new, it's kind of declared as if we know all these things and everything is knowable.
Right.
But I don't actually think that's the stance of science.
Well, particularly with physicists, I mean, the more you dive deep,
they're
it's
just throwing
bananas.
Their hands up all the time.
Yeah, it's like how do you even begin to understand what these things mean?
I've been watching these wonderful videos of this physicist, Nima Arkani Hamed, who's brilliant and hard to understand, but I do my best. But he spends most of his time talking about how space-time is no longer something that we think is fundamental. Mm-hmm. That there's something that's more fundamental than space-time, that basically there is no, at a fundamental level, there is no space and time. So if we're never going to get our minds around that, even if we can believe it.
Well, time is a focus of the book in the later chapters, and I want to get to that. But let's start with let's just define our terms here. Like when we're talking about consciousness, what do we actually mean? So
people do use the word many different ways, and it's confusing. The way I'm using the word in the book, and what I think most people mean when they're talking about the mystery of consciousness, the kind of the consciousness in the most fundamental sense, is the closest word I can get to is experience. And I use Thomas Nagel's description of consciousness from his essay called What It Is Like to Be a Bat, which is a great essay, and I recommend from the 70s. And he says in that essay, an organism is conscious if there is something that it is like to be that organism. And that language, for a lot of people, they kind of get it right away. I actually, for me, that happened. I knew exactly what he meant, but the language really isn't very precise and it can be confusing. So I usually follow that up with a series of questions, especially for someone who just says, I don't know what that means to say it's like something. And so I'll say, is there something that it's like to be you right now? And I run through this in the book. And of course, whoever I'm asking, we all know we're having an experience, right? We're conscious and we're having an experience. And then is there something that it's like to be this book on the table? And our intuitive answer is no. And despite what's actually true in the world, the fact that we can imagine a collection of matter in the universe that entails no experience at all. The lights are not on from the inside, right? That's non-conscious material. And then a collection of matter in the universe, like your brain, where there's something that it's like to be that matter. That difference is consciousness, and it's how I'm using the word in the book. Although I actually prefer experience. I think it's a slightly less confusing.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about that definition over the last week, and I can't escape this sense that it's still reductive in the sense that we're looking at experience through our own experience, right? We're defining what experience means only through the lens of what it means and feels like to be human. And it doesn't leave a lot of space or room for contemplating that experience could take another form that we can't relate to.
Well, yes and no. No, I think, but that's where I'm talking at a more fundamental level. So I think, and that's partly what I try to do in the book, is strip away everything that could be human. Like you could radically change an experience, but the fact of any experience at all. And, I get into these more far out theories, but even if you contemplate that, a single cell or bacteria has some minimal level of experience that you and I could never imagine what it would be like. If there's any experience, even the most minimal experience you could imagine, if there's something it's like, then that is consciousness. And that could be completely unlike any human experience.
Right.
It's just whether it's completely dark and dead, whether the stars, there's no experience there at all. It's a collection of atoms that are doing their thing, but there's nothing that it feels like at all. Or there is.
Or there is, right. In a very binary way.
Yeah, well, and yes and no. I mean, it's in a binary way once you go from nothing to something. But then, of course, there's this gradation of what's possible in experience once you have experience. But yeah, I think you can say that it's either there or not. Right.
The fact that it exists begs the question of the evolutionary advantage of having it at all. Like, what is the reason that we developed this?
Yeah.
As opposed to, the sort of zombie example that you use in the book.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a very interesting question, and that's kind of where my thinking started. And it's early on in the book that I pose these two questions that I think. So I have two categories of intuitions that I want to challenge. One category is our intuitions about consciousness itself, and then intuitions that occur in other areas that are in our lives that strongly influence or inform our intuitions about consciousness. And so I kind of put those into two separate categories, and I start with consciousness. And I just, for myself, in my own notes, I just wanted to get at what are the most basic, strongest intuitions we have about consciousness. And so I asked these two questions in the book. One is there behavior we can point to from outside a system that we can use as conclusive evidence that consciousness is present in that system, right? Is there something we can witness from the outside, some physical behavior that we could say, yes, anytime we see behavior A, B, or C, that's absolute evidence of consciousness. And I think our intuitive answer is yes. And it's a very strong yes. And even after dissecting this for 15 years, my answer is still yes. So an example of that would be, there are so many, but I often use, my daughter. If my daughter's fallen down and she's crying and asking for a Band-Aid, all of that behavior, to me, absolutely signifies that there's consciousness present, right? She's having an experience of pain, and so I wanted to start there because I thought this is an important exercise in all areas of science, and this is where our strongest intuitions are. But could we be wrong? Mm-hmm. Is it possible that the behavior that we think is evidence of consciousness is not necessarily evidence of consciousness? And so you can kind of go in the direction of AI and imagine we might in the future create something that seems like a child who is crying because she fell down, but the lights are actually not on. There's no consciousness there. But I think the flip side of that is also interesting, which is even if we can come up with behaviors, and I for myself, I can't. And I think it's super interesting that we can't. But on the other side of that, we know that consciousness can be present with no behavior at all.
Right. So you use the diving bell and the butterfly as an example of that.
Have you read that book?
I saw the movie.
So beautifully written. So that's based on a writer who had something called locked-in syndrome, where I believe his was due to a stroke, but it can happen a variety of ways that damage the brain, like a stroke. And it left him completely paralyzed, but with a full experience of consciousness, as full as our experience is right now, as full as his experience was before the stroke. Mm-hmm. He could hear, see, think, write a book, but he had no way. He was completely paralyzed, except for, in his case, his left eyelid. There was some mobility left in his left eyelid, and miraculously his caretakers noticed this, and they were able to develop a way for him to write through. I don't know the
Blinking,
exact details, but each blink
language
created a certain letter, and then he would spell out words and wrote this beautiful book. But so that's a case of, even if we can find behavior, there's this other problem in terms of behavior, which is there can be zero behavior and still be a tremendously detailed experience of consciousness.
The philosophical zombie example is super interesting, and I think it's related directly to what we're facing now with the advent of AI and this uncanny valley. Like, we see these videos online of robots doing things that look very human, and it freaks us out. But to extrapolate that example to its extreme, whether it's a zombie or a robot that is manifesting human behavior in all of its forms, knows exactly what to say and how to behave, and demonstrates an outward manifestation of things like empathy and et cetera, but technically the lights aren't on, the closer, it's like this asymptotic curve, like the closer it approximates human behavior, the question of consciousness almost in and of itself seems to fall away. Like, what is the relevance of consciousness if somebody is mimicking it to such a precise degree? Is it even a thing?
Is a consciousness even a thing?
Like, you know what I mean?
It's clearly a thing because it's actually the only thing we can be sure exists. I mean, everything else might not be what we think it is. We could literally be brains in a vat or in some computer generated alternate
the Matrix
virtual reality.
Thing.
But the experience you're having is the experience you're having, right? Like, whatever it is, whatever it feels like, that is what consciousness is. And so I think, so the thing that's interesting with AI is we will have no way of knowing unless we have a better understanding of consciousness ahead of time.
But then I guess my question is really like, does it matter then if it's so...
No, I know what you mean. And I think it has to matter because it is why anything matters, right? Like, if someone, you can use a lot of examples, but basically everything that matters to us, any ethical question, it has to do with consciousness. If we're talking about an unconscious system, we don't have any ethical obligations towards them. We're not worried about them. We don't have to think about suffering. Like, all of suffering happens in consciousness. And so the difference is everything. If we brought in some advanced AI that looked like another human being who just came in, was introduced to us, if the scientist who brought this robot in said, "Don't worry, this robot's not conscious," we would have it would still be hard for us because our intuition. Yeah, oh, absolutely, and it's everything that matters in terms of mattering. I mean, if this being starts to suffer in any way, if we think they're having an experience, we want to help it.
Mm-hmm. It's strange times that we're heading into. You know what I mean?
Yes, it is.
Well, the kind of operating definition for everybody who's walking around without any kind of more precise familiarity with this is this alignment of consciousness with identity and a sense of self, right? And another one of the intuitions that you try to break down a little bit is the fundamental illusion of self and the distinction between consciousness and our, I guess, lack of selfhood, and also drawing a distinction between consciousness and complex thought. So talk about that a little bit.
So these kind of fall into this other category of illusions that show up in other areas of life, but I think strongly inform our ideas about what consciousness is. And so the self and conscious will, which is not exactly free will, and I can talk a little bit about distinguishing between the two, but for me, the important piece is the idea, the feeling that we have conscious will and the feeling of being a self, a self being kind of a self-contained individual entity that, our intuition is actually, it's strange when you say it because you realize there's something false about the intuition just in describing it, right? But what I feel myself to be, even though I've worked with a lot of neuroscientists, I understand that everything I'm experiencing is due to all of this processing in my brain. There's some sense that there's a me, that's this kind of distinct me that is in some way separate from brain processing, that can make these decisions, even if my brain is, pushing me in one direction and, telling me I should go get a coffee right now because I'm feeling tired or thirsty or whatever, and then I decide, now is not the right time to get a coffee. So there's this sense that there's the me that can choose to follow my instincts or not, and that is the thing that is making all of the choices. And so the self and conscious will are really part of the same illusion, and it's the sense that there's a separate self that has this will. And so there's a lot of neuroscience now disproving, showing that these are truly illusions. And many people have had the experience of breaking through these illusions in meditation through use of psychedelics. And we now know actually the kind of network in the brain called the default mode network is responsible for creating this sense of self. And so when that is quieted through meditation or psychedelics or by other means, people talk about having the same kind of experience of realizing that way they usually experience themselves is a kind of illusion.
Right, that consciousness exists outside of the self. Our sense of our illusory sense of who we are.
Yeah. Well, and then also just in terms of how the brain processes things and how many things are happening before it rises to the level of our awareness, so that often, if not always, there's a lot of research suggesting that this is basically always the case, that every time we feel like we've made this free decision, we were contemplating two different choices and we decide to go with option A, that has already taken place in terms of processing before we are aware of it. And there are other systems that we know much more about, actually, that are just like this. And binding is one of them that I talk about in the book.
Yeah, so binding is the way for people to really grok what this is all about, in the sense that we receive these inputs from the outside world at differing speeds. Like we see something before we hear it. there is this delay mechanism wherein our brain assembles all of these inputs in some kind of Final Cut Pro program and then presents it to us in a cohesive whole. But that's not the way. That's not the way it actually happens, and that the kind of behavioral reactions that we manifest in response to those occur prior to our conscious awareness of having done so.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a bummer.
It depends on how you think about it. I think it's kind of magical. You can. I mean, I can see.
You know what I mean?
I mean, it's also realizing that our experience of will, our conscious will, isn't what it feels like. Either can be a bummer, but I think there's another way to look at it.
I mean, we want to believe that we're sentient beings that are in control of our actions and reactions, and truly we are not. It's
a very controversial point, actually, because people get very emotional about it, and I thought long and hard before I included it in the book, actually. Dismantling conscious will.
Well, your husband has written extensively about this idea.
Yeah.
So it's not new to anyone who's coming to you via him.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
But still.
Yeah. I had this guy, Dr. Judd Brewer, in here 2 days ago, and he's done a lot. He's done a lot of work on the default mode network, doing fMRIs on people's brains after mindfulness and meditation practices, and we talked a lot about
the dissolution of the self.
As well. A little bit, but more. He's more in the mindfulness space, and it was super interesting to see that relationship of sort of toning down or turning off the default mode network and the dissolution of our sense of identity or self, allowing pure consciousness to enter and kind of the impact of that experience.
Yeah. I actually would be curious to know how many people experience that as positive versus negative, but there's a positive way to experience that, and it can be extremely positive.
Right.
It's part of the reason why there's been so much success with this psychedelic research on PTSD, that part of the healing is actually realizing that the sense of a separate self is an illusion, and there's kind of a connectedness with everyone and everything that comes about when you quiet that default mode network. So.
Yeah, I think the experience, if you've had it, is universally positive because it provides a sense of connectivity to the world.
Right.
But I think intellectually, it's hard to grapple with.
And very hard to grapple with. Yeah. No, it's completely counterintuitive, and I think that's part of the reason why this process is probably going to take a long time. Like the process, even just of the neuroscience we now have and know to be true, it's taking forever, even for some of the neuroscientists who are doing the work to really be able to accept the implications. Because it is just it's not the way we're wired to think about things. It's not the way we're wired to experience things. But again, it's the reason why I think it's such an important thing to be doing right now with consciousness, because I think it is the only path to deeper understanding and to better understanding.
Right.
Yeah.
We have this idea that our consciousness, there's a locus for our consciousness, and it resides in our head, behind our eyes.
Yeah.
And that's fundamentally, the makeup of who we are, and a way of looking at that or defying our intuition about that is you've talked a lot about this on other shows, but on a neuroscience level, understanding that neuroscientists have not been able to find that. It's not like, it resides right here in this part of the brain. We see it flaring up when we activate it.
Right.
And also this practice of from that book about the pretending you don't have a head, or like what it's like to not have a head.
No head.
Yeah, having no head.
Yeah.
To understand that consciousness can't be located in any geographical precise location.
Yeah. I think that consciousness can, in some sense. The self can't. I mean, there is no self.
Now I'm confused. Go ahead.
So there are different ways of looking at it. And as I say in my book that I'm kind of 50-50 on this at this point. But we basically assume that consciousness is created by, at the very least, a brain and a central nervous system. So we can kind of look at it from that perspective. There are all these other theories that I carefully talk about in my book, which I completely rejected myself for many years and didn't even think they merited my reading.
If you're talking about
panpsychism. Talking about panpsychism.
We're going to get to that, trust me.
We've already gotten to it, so I need to give a little disclaimer before we start really talking about it. But panpsychism is this category of theories that posits that consciousness could be a fundamental feature of the universe, down to the level of atoms, even possibly originating out of some sort of field, the fluctuations of which give matter this intrinsic property of experience. So that there are all these physical properties of matter, and then there's actually an intrinsic property of all matter, so that there's some level of experience wherever there is matter present. So you can kind of answer this question of where consciousness is in space-time from either angle. From if we just assume consciousness exists only in brains, we know that is. I mean, there's no like pinpoint location, right? But the brain itself is creating a certain experience that it does not exist in your chalkboard, right? Your chalkboard is not participating in the experience of my brain, and so as far as we know, so there's some sense in which you can talk about a physical location in a brain-based view of consciousness. But even if you go down some panpsychic rabbit hole, it's still, at least for the theories that make sense to me, the way that I and there are theories that don't make sense to me within panpsychism. I mean, I definitely, when I consider those views, and so as I was saying, I rejected it categorically for a long time. It just sounded completely crazy to me and went against everything that I understood about the brain. And the more I fixated on this subject and the more I read and the more I thought about it, the more open I actually became. My own thoughts actually started leading me there, like what if? And then I realized there was this category of theories called panpsychism, and so then I started doing research there. And there are actually many mainstream, well-respected scientists who take some view, either within panpsychism or some, basically a panpsychic view, whether or not they call it that by the name, which I've said many times, a terrible name. we need a new name. Yeah. But it's so taboo for scientists to consider something like this. And a few have actually done it publicly, which I think is incredible. Most of them, there are many more of them than I realized because they won't admit it publicly, right. Because it's such a career ender. So I do truly believe it's a legitimate category of theories that we should be open to. And now I forgot your question. I was answering some other question.
It doesn't matter. We're all in on panpsychism now. So,
consciousness, the physical location of consciousness. Right. So within panpsychism, still each area of matter would entail whatever experience makes sense for that area of matter, even under panpsychism. Right. So I think there's a sense in which consciousness, no matter how you look at it, is tied to matter.
Right. That consciousness can be redefined, and perhaps it's not exactly what we think it is, and it's a fundamental aspect of all matter, going down to, the atom all the way up to the human being and beyond. And I have to say that activates my, new age proclivities. It's right. Like I want to believe that that's true so badly.
The beyond part?
Yeah,
the whole thing?
I just think it's cool. It's like, wow, think about that. Like, wouldn't that be amazing? That everything we thought about consciousness, it's so much more complicated and vast to be an essential property of what the universe is comprised of is an amazing idea. Yeah. And it's I guess it's a reality, but it's sort of disheartening that there are certain ideas out there that would be career enders for scientists just to talk about and think about, because science is science at the cutting edge has to be about asking questions that no one's willing to ask and exploring them as open-mindedly as possible. Yes,
I agree. And I think it's kind of the right time to start making noises about this because there are a variety of reasons, but I can see why it's gotten such a bad rap, and I can see the ways in which science gets threatened, and also the ways in which certain theories get co-opted by some ridiculous, pseudoscientific New Age idea, and then those scientists kind of get implicated in this they have to be careful.
Yeah, I get it.
But it's a legitimate category of theories, and it's incredibly interesting. And given that we've made no progress on what's called the hard problem of consciousness, the fact that it's still so deeply mysterious, and that it doesn't seem that more understanding of brain processes will give us more information about this fundamental nature of consciousness, what it actually is. This is where I started. These are the moments in science where we have to start challenging intuitions and be open to maybe we've been thinking about it all wrong.
The kind of way in here seems to me to be by challenging this the emergent phenomenon of consciousness, this idea that, yes, we understand as human beings that we are conscious and that perhaps animals are, but as you slide down the scale, at what point is something that is technically alive, that is cellular, not conscious? Right. And, from a binary perspective, is it a switch that gets flicked? At what point does a fetus become conscious? Yeah. There has to be some demarcation line, right? And the more you look and dive into that, you realize it's a gradation kind of thing. But is there does semi-consciousness become consciousness? And then if so, what is semi-consciousness? It all falls apart.
Yeah. No, I mean, in some sense, it kind of has to be binary. If there's a spectrum, either all of reality is the spectrum, or you drop off the spectrum at the end of the spectrum. Right. So at that point, it's binary.
Right. So
that's just this eternal mystery that we don't seem anywhere close to having any idea how to solve. And so I do think kind of flipping the question is incredibly interesting, especially since so much of the science is actually very intuition challenging already, and we can kind of start there and just see. I mean, and my book is all about asking questions. I think it's interesting, even if what we're asking is wrong, and there's a clear, and what our intuitions are telling us is right. There's no reason not to say, let's just totally break this open. Yeah.
So if you were to define consciousness at the molecular level, like what would that definition be?
I think the definition is always the same, even though it's hard to have a definition. But I think it's always the same, as long as you're talking about consciousness in its most fundamental sense. So experience is the best word I can come up with. But if there is any experience at all, if there's something that it's like to be that matter, to be that collection of atoms, then there is consciousness present there. If it's completely dead and the lights are out and there's absolutely no experience being had, then it's not. But you need a very broad definition of experience. Experience not in the sense of what we would qualify as experience. Maybe, so this is the problem with a lot of these words. I think experience is the cleanest word. I think awareness brings in other things that aren't necessarily conscious. Experience, we usually think of it as something more complex, because more complex creatures having a very complex experience. And so it's kind of the problem with all talking about consciousness in general is we are these incredibly complex systems. The brain is the most complex thing we know of in the universe, right? And our experience is of being that. So we assume that consciousness is complex because we associate it with our own experience. And don't know how or if we can apply it to other things. But I think there are ways that we can imagine. There are little thought experiments. And there's, in the beginning of one of my chapters, one of the chapters in my book, I do a little bit of a guided visualization to try to get someone to imagine, even, from the perspective of a baby. I don't use a baby in this sense, but at least that brings it to the human level. What experience is like when you start stripping away all of our inputs, like we're without sight, without hearing, without, if you're just talking about super minimal. I think there's some way in which we can imagine, a worm, say, which many people think worms aren't conscious, but you can imagine there's something that it's like to be a worm. There's some level of consciousness there. it would be so incredibly minimal, right? Like whatever the feeling is, it would be probably not even in the sense of a localized self. It might be like pressure or heat or...
Right.
And so I think we can imagine experience being very, very minimal. And my guess is that if it does go as far down as worms or even deeper, it just gets more and more minimal.
Right. Along those lines, I want to talk about the consciousness in the plant kingdom.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's some super interesting stuff
so
here, especially
interesting.
like the Douglas fir example that you use.
Right. So I didn't know a lot of this before I wrote my book. I did all of this research, most of the research for the book. And what's interesting is I brought in plant behavior kind of to prove the opposite point. I didn't bring plant behavior because I think plants are conscious, although this point kind of makes you question whether they are. But I brought it in because I was addressing this issue of, are there behaviors we can point to that are evidence, absolute evidence of consciousness? And there are so many plant behaviors that are so much more similar than I realized, and I think than most people realize, down to the mechanism. So it's kind of like behavior that you would describe in similar terms to the way we describe human behavior, but they're also similar genes, similar processes of cell changes resulting in electrical signals in much the same way that our brains do. And of course, they're very different, but they're similar enough that I use it because we assume plants are not conscious. Uh-huh. And so you can kind of play this trick on yourself by saying, okay, if plants do these things that when humans do them, we say that that's evidence of consciousness, but we assume plants are not conscious. They're doing all of this without consciousness. Why maybe we don't need consciousness for these behaviors in humans? And this was just part of the intuition challenging that I was doing. But yeah, so you spoke about the tree behavior, the Douglas fir and the birch. This is the work of Susan Simard. I don't know if you've seen her TED Talk.
No.
It's so worth watching. She did work in the Canadian National Forest, and I actually think she grew some of her own trees in her own like lab setting to study the communications that happen underground in what are called mycorrhizal networks. These are fungal networks under the ground. So there are root systems, but there are also systems of fungus that help trees communicate to each other, share carbon with each other. They share defense signals. There is this incredibly elaborate system of communication happening underground. Some of which, and I use this in my book because it mimics human behavior to some extent, where the trees that have dropped seedlings, she refers to them as the mother trees, are able to recognize through these networks which trees that have grown in the forest are their own kin. Right. And they send them more carbon, and they send them defense signals that they're not sending to other trees. And there's a sense in which they're protecting
They are
their
literally
children.
Protecting their kids. Yeah. It's unbelievable.
They make more room for their roots. And you can see how this could all happen without consciousness, right? Like it's all trippy, but you could still say, okay, that's so interesting. All that happens. There's all this communication and cells talking to each other. And that could all just be happening in the dark, right? That could be happening in the same way that we imagine our computer processing systems are happening in the dark. And if that's true, why do we think all of these things that we're doing require consciousness? And so I think that's an interesting starting point. But it does also make you wonder if trees are conscious.
Yeah. I mean, what comes up for me when I think about that is the beautiful symbiosis of these ecologies, right? Like we're caught up in our sense of self, where we separate ourselves from others. I mean, you talk about stardust, and we can go, we're all stardust, but when you really think about that we don't. Yeah, and when you think about the limitations of free will and the fact that we're just truly reacting to our environments, and there is no, impermeable barrier between ourselves and the world and the sun and all of these things, that we're reacting constantly to our environment, and that we are very much in that same place of responding to our environment and adapting. Yeah. Trees and forests and all of these sorts of things are instructive because they show us that the integration is so undeniable when you drill down on it.
Yeah, I know. So I've been using plants more recently. I've been getting into more hairy discussions about free will, and you can use plant behavior to talk about this as well, because you don't think the plants are making this decision like, okay, now I'm going to give more carbon to you over there. And they are, as you said, there's this complex way in which they are connected and responding. And we don't, in plant behavior, we don't mistake that response, however complex and interesting it is, for free will.
Right.
And I think you can map that onto human beings as well, that there's a sense in which it's all a system, from the brain to our bodies to the air we're breathing to the sound waves that I'm speaking that are bouncing off your ear. I mean, there's this connection that we don't see, but that is there.
Not only do we not see it, our brains are rigged to convince us that it's something very different.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do with that, though.
I know.
I can tell you this, as somebody who's been vegan, like plant-based, for a very long time, like in the Twitterverse, like the plant consciousness argument comes up a lot.
Interesting. Yeah.
I mean? So,
I actually just heard someone for the first time use it for the reverse argument, which I'd never heard before, which was they're so complex, and they seem like, the sense that he'd spent, it was
Was this a podcast that you did? I think I listened to it. He's the guy who went to the Amazon.
Yes.
And he was immersed in that biosphere, and it gave him such an
Corey
appreciation.
Allen.
Yeah.
Yes. That there was some sense of like, how is this type of consciousness any more important than that type of consciousness?
Right.
And I don't follow that path. And I think there are reasons to think that suffering, there's definitely a range of suffering. And even if plants are conscious, and I mean, even if everything's conscious, I think you can definitely make a good argument for some things being able to suffer a lot more than other things.
Well, what was interesting about that is that he said he was a longtime vegetarian, and then he had that experience in the Amazonian rainforest, and then he began eating meat after that because he saw himself as just part of this greater whole. But I couldn't help but thinking, yeah, but eating all those animals is actually contributing to the destruction of this thing that you fell in love with.
Right.
So I was like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. No, there are ways to see it differently for sure. But it does, I think all of that shaking up our intuition specifically about self and free will and just about consciousness in general get us to see things very differently. And I think, for me, it brings me a lot of joy. And it was really the first reason I decided to turn my notes into something that I was writing for the public, was really just to share this feeling of awe that I get in contemplating all of this. And I think it can do that. I think it can be kind of a source of a spiritual experience. And that's it's another word we can use about 100 different ways.
Yeah.
But for me, as someone who's not religious, and I feel like I'm a fairly spiritual person, a lot of it comes from contemplating things like this. And surrendering.
How does that work with your famous atheist husband?
I think he's a very spiritual person too.
I think he is too.
I don't like to use the word.
I think he is. I really do.
Yeah, neither of us like the word for obvious reasons. But he actually used it. I'm forgetting now which book. I should know. But he used it in one of his books, and he gives, in Waking Up, he uses the word spiritual, and he talks about why he thinks it's a necessary word, and it shouldn't mean all the things that people have used it for. And there's actually a new, it's not that new, but Thomas Metzinger is a philosopher who's wonderful, and he wrote something about spirituality. I don't know how long ago, but not that long ago, and I actually posted an excerpt of it on my website, because it's so beautiful and brilliant, and is a kind of an argument for taking the word back to mean something very different from what it generally means in pop culture now. His essay is called Spirituality and Intellectual Honesty, or maybe the other way around, Intellectual Honesty and Spirituality. But he equates spirituality with a kind of a scientific mindset of seeking truth. And So his article has made me think a lot about spirituality and what I mean by spirituality when I say it. And I absolutely, in the same way that I think of myself that way, I absolutely think of Sam that way. And yeah, for me, it's more of a kind of staring into the unknown while seeking truth and feeling this intimate connection to the rest of the universe. And so, that can be done through meditation. I mean, it can be done in a variety of ways,
right.
But
I mean, I think, well, first of all, a guy who stops out of college because he has an experience and goes on a 10-year journey that takes him to ashrams and all these, this guy's a seeker, You can call it spiritual or whatever, but he's on a journey for greater, deeper understanding. Yeah. And I don't see science and spirituality as incompatible at all. In fact, your book is testament to that. The more you drill down on these crazy ideas, the more room you provide for awe and wonder at just how mysterious and amazing all of this is.
Yeah. No, that's what I think. That's why I call it, I hesitantly call it a source of spirituality for me. Yeah.
So another intuition that you confront and debunk about consciousness or what we think about when we think about ourselves has to do with you explore it through like these split brain experiments and toxoplasma that allows you to realize like that, hey, we're not so much in control, or that consciousness isn't exactly this unified entity.
Yeah. So this is some of the research I use to help people break through or see the sense of self and conscious will as illusions. So the split brain research, I think, does this incredibly well. And this, do you want me to explain?
Yeah.
So this is research that was first done by the neuroscientists Michael Gazzaniga and Roger Sperry, and they were doing research on patients who'd had a surgery to essentially split the brain in two. This sounds like a horrific procedure, but it actually helped a lot of people with epilepsy. Because an epileptic seizure is essentially an electrical storm that can spread. The most devastating, most dangerous ones spread throughout the brain. And so they discovered that if they cut the brain through the corpus callosum and essentially split it into its separate halves, it would prevent the electrical storm from spreading to the entire brain. And many patients got incredible relief from this. And for the most part, you couldn't tell. They seemed normal and healthy after the fact. Through this research, they discovered that there was a sense in which the person, the two split sides of the brain were kind of like separate people in terms of their consciousness and in terms of their will as well. And so, do you want me to describe some of the experiments?
Yeah, it's super interesting.
It's super interesting. I never tire of thinking about this and what it must be like. But essentially, the patients end up like conjoined twins almost, where they have like separate minds, but they're sharing this body. So one of the famous experiments is of a split brain patient. So the way the brain works is our visual field, the right side of the visual field gets projected on to the left hemisphere. The left visual field is projected onto the right hemisphere. The same is true for a lot of things like our hands. The sense perceptions from our hands go to the opposite hemisphere. And so they were able to kind of separately question and communicate with each side of the brain. So they would flash a word. I think in my book I use the one where they flash the word key. And they flash that to the left visual field, which would only go to the right side of the brain because that's where it goes. And normally that would be shared across the corpus callosum, but this has been split, so it only gets received by the right hemisphere. So the right hemisphere has seen the word key. The left hemisphere hasn't seen anything. And when you ask the person, also the speaking center of the brain, language communication is not always, but usually in the left hemisphere. In this patient, it was in the left hemisphere. So the experimenter asks the person, what word did you just see? And they say, I didn't see anything. And that's because the speaking part of the brain is the left hemisphere. Then there'll be a bunch of objects on the table, rocks and coins and things for them to choose from. Then they'll say, reach out and pick up the object of the word you just saw. And the person with their left hand, because it's controlled by their right hemisphere, who saw the word key, will reach out and pick up a key. And this is just replicated over and over again with the same results. And there are different ways that they can ask various questions. There was a child, I'm forgetting the name they used for him. I think they kept his name anonymous, but they used a name, but he was famous for having the ability actually to speak with both hemispheres. And so they were able to get a lot of information from him, but they would ask him questions and he would have different answers depending on which hemisphere they projected the question to. So
it's crazy.
He wanted to be one side wanted to be, I forget now, but one side wanted to be a draftsman when he grew up and the other side wanted to be something else. And
oh my God.
There are bizarre cases of one half of their brain being an atheist and the other one being a Christian. So the whole range is possible, but it really is like you end up with conjoined twins rather than a single unified brain.
So what do you make of this? Like, how does this inform how you think about consciousness?
So there are a couple of ways, and actually the interpreter is something that comes up here that I didn't mention, which is super interesting, which is the language side of the brain. I think it was Michael Gazzaniga and another scientist kind of came up with this term, the interpreter, for this experience that they noticed, or phenomenon they noticed again and again in these patients, where they would give a command to the patient to get up and walk to the end of the room. And so the patient would do this. Sorry, the details are always so confusing.
I know, it's hard to, I know the example.
So it's to the right they tell the right hemisphere, get up and walk. And they'll get up and walk to the back of the room. Then they ask the person, so the speaking left hemisphere is going to answer, why did you just get up? And the left hemisphere is not aware of that command. So the left hemisphere doesn't actually have information about why his body got up and started walking. And in most cases, it will come up with an instantaneous response that kind of makes sense, that it doesn't seem that it's a lie. It doesn't seem like the person fabricated this. It's a function of the brain to kind of have an answer. And he'll say, I got thirsty. I was standing up to get a glass of water. And this is a little bit of an insight into conscious will. The idea that, and many neuroscientists think there's something like this. There's a kind of an interpreter effect happening all the time, or a lot of the time, where we have this unconscious brain processing. It kind of rises to the level of consciousness, and we think we know the reason. Mm-hmm. And we may not be right about that reason.
Right. We're sort of post hoc coming up with rationalizations for behaviors that are already underway.
Yeah.
Right. You used an example also of you being startled from a noise in the middle of the night before you were, like your body moved before you heard the thing.
Yeah. And that was more kind of an interruption of the binding process, which I think is, and there are these disorders that interrupt binding so that people don't actually experience the sights and the sounds of things in the same moment, happening at the same moment.
How does that manifest in an individual? Like if they're not binding properly, it's this mishmash of everything coming in at different times.
Yeah. There's a category of disorders called agnosia, which is the inability of the brain to process sensory information together. So there's a whole range. I mean, there's strange things that can happen. I just discovered there's something called finger agnosia, which is the inability to differentiate between your different fingers. But basically, everything we experience is the brain is doing all of this for us, right? Like once you start to pull these things apart, and the split brain research does the same thing. It's like everything that we kind of take for granted and think this is the way things are, you manipulate the brain a little bit and you realize
it just breaks down. Yeah. Like if you split somebody's brain and one side's an atheist and one side's a Christian, what does that say about how we think about who we are?
Right.
What is the self?
Right. Yeah.
Or is there no such thing?
Right. Yeah.
That gets back to the bummer part.
I guess I always see two paths there. Like there's a fork in the road. You can go the bummer path, but you can also go the kind of like surrendering to this bizarre universe we're in and just letting it be something different than you thought it was. Yeah. I mean, I feel like whatever we discover, it's all kind of magical. Yeah. I'm sure you notice this having kids. They ask you to explain everything and they don't understand anything. And you realize every answer is crazy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. You're answering it and you're like, sky. Why am I saying? Yeah, exactly.
Something about the sky is blue and when we breathe, are we breathing the sky? And she's just trying to understand the universe.
Right, yeah. Extending the mycorrhizal example is this toxoplasma
right.
example that you use, which just also further, enhances the mystery of all of this when you realize that your neurology can be hijacked by these, microscopic entities that then take over and control your behavior.
Yeah, all the parasite research is so interesting. Mm-hmm. And I knew a little bit about it before I started writing the book as a book, but I did a lot more reading, and it just gets creepier and creepier. But parasites control the behavior of their hosts, and they do it with neurochemicals or not always, but often. They're either mimicking the neurochemicals of the creature it's invading, or they're just disrupting some system so that they get the creature to do what it needs it to do for its own needs. Toxoplasma, that's an interesting one. That's one a lot of people know about in cats, where it needs to reproduce in the intestines of a cat. And so in order to, but then it part of its life cycle happens outside of the cat, but it needs to eventually make its way back to a cat. And so, rats that are infected with this parasite, who normally have a natural fear of cats, this parasite alters their brain chemistry in such a way that they actually become less fearful in general, but they are less fearful of cats. They can be drawn to cats. They're drawn to the smell of cat urine. Like they suddenly become...
They just run headlong into the cat.
They do so in some cases, yeah. And that's just this parasite needing to get back. But my point about all of that is there's some sense in which we're already in that circumstance, right? Like we are, our conscious experience is really at the mercy of whatever processing we are a part of.
There's some interesting science happening right now in the microbiome where they're discovering this nexus between the quality of your gut flora and the foods that you crave.
Yeah.
And that, again, you think like, well, my body's telling me I need this. It's like, no, actually, this thing inside of you, that's what it feeds on.
Well, and your body is hardly your body. I mean, I forget the numbers, but it's some
it's like
ridiculous percentage, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, the ultimate kind of wrench in this whole thing that just takes it off a cliff is time. So let's talk about time.
Okay. I feel like I'm not qualified to talk about time. Although I will say I keep recommending his book because I think it's so beautifully done. Carlo Rovelli's new book on time called The Order of Time. I think one of the reasons I love it, but it's a great book on an accessible way to kind of understand where the science is at this point. But he does this, he ends the book on consciousness, and he kind of talks about how the two are interrelated. And I love that because I end my book on time. And there is some sense in which, whether at the level of physics they're interrelated, we don't know. But our conscious experience certainly couldn't exist without time. There's something, it's in many ways all about time.
So explain that.
Okay.
Like how does that work?
Right. So I think many people have this experience in meditation, and a lot of the kids that I teach communicate this experience quite often, that it starts to make them wonder what the present moment is. So our experience is just forever in what we feel is the present moment, right? It's this experience of what's now. When you start to pay closer and closer attention to that, it's hard to even understand what we mean by now and in what sense time is moving. And it's interesting that we use the word moving. It's like we talk about time in spatial sense.
Right.
And Yeah, so I think it's interesting, even just, how much, I talk about this in the last chapter, how much time do we need for a conscious moment, right? Mm-hmm. And this may be different for humans than for other animals.
Is it come in flickering intervals, or is it a continuum?
Right.
And it gets into, you then explore these two kind of countervailing theories of presentism versus eternalism, mm-hmm, and how we think about time.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think Carlo Rovelli actually says neither of them are right. Although he basically says there is no such thing as time as we experience it and we think of it to be. That it completely falls apart. There's no present moment in the universe that is consistent throughout the universe, right? There's things at the quantum level, there's no past and present even, like things go in both directions. Uh-huh. And you can't tell one from the other. What was your question?
I don't know.
I'm confusing myself.
So we experience time in a presentism context, like it's flowing, in a narrative, linear way.
Right.
But the science suggests that it probably is more of an eternalism kind of thing, that all of these things are happening simultaneously in multi-dimensions and in a way that we can't even really fully understand.
Yeah. Well, and I think whether or not eternalism is the right way to describe it, like the block universe, I think is a controversial concept. The idea that it's a static thing, that every point in time exists always. But presentism doesn't seem accurate either.
Right.
I mean, it's clearly not accurate, but it's interesting that that's the way we experience the world, and there's something about our experience that kind of lights up these different, when we call them moments, and we're only experiencing them one at a time.
Mm-hmm. So why explore time, though? Like, what is the relationship between how we're trying to understand time and how we are trying to think about consciousness?
I mean, for me, the reason I brought it up in the book mostly is just because I think it's incredibly interesting. That our experience of the present moment is something we can't even quite get our minds around, our own experience of what it is. Actually, Donald Hoffman is doing this work. I don't know if you're aware of him. He's very interesting. He has a book coming out in August called The Case Against Reality. And he is he's doing this with this very rigorous science. And I think some scientists are questioning what he's doing, but I think it's very interesting, and he's certainly grounded in science. But his question is: are we thinking about it backwards? Mm-hmm. So is it so hard to understand consciousness because we're living in this non-conscious universe that somehow gives rise to consciousness? That's not the right way to think about it. Is it possible that consciousness is fundamental and gives rise to the physical world?
Oh wow.
And so, even he will say, I might be wrong, but we should explore this.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
And so those are the types of places that these intersections happen between the mysteries we're coming up against in quantum mechanics and
right. In your research,
what we don't know about
in your research for doing the book, what really out there ideas did you come across that didn't make the cut? You know what I mean? Like, you went out on a limb to include this panpsychism, sorry.
Parapsychism is even worse.
Parapsychism. Yeah, I know that would be worse. And I know in your podcast with Sam, he's like, he's saying like he was trying to talk you out of this. But I would imagine you came across some other stuff too. You're like, that's a little too out there.
Yeah, I think there are some. My feeling is that some people have taken what I think are legitimate questions within panpsychism to make all kinds of claims like the universe is... there's something called the combination problem in panpsychism, which I talk a little bit about in the book because I actually don't see it as a problem. I think it's partly because we're confused about being selves and that illusion that's misleading us there. But within this, the combination problem is essentially the philosophical problem. If panpsychism is true, how is it that these smaller points of consciousness in the atoms of my body and the cells come together to create this other form of consciousness. And I don't think about it that way. When I contemplate panpsychism, that's not the way I think about it. But so then the natural next question is there some kind of human, larger human consciousness or consciousness of the universe? There was an article recently, I think, titled, "Is the Universe Conscious?" So I think, again, confusing consciousness with complex thought.
Right.
I think it's really a misunderstanding of the implications of panpsychism that lead people to what look to me like slightly religious beliefs that for many people give them gets them out of the feeling that they're bummed. This is what we're coming across, and they want to believe that there's.
Yeah,
it's interesting. It's not comforting to me. It's interesting, but I get why it would be comforting. But the idea that there's some plan, there's some path, there's this higher consciousness. We don't, we can let go of God, but now we're going to use this other thing as a placement for God. But the idea that human brains that aren't connected would have some bigger mind that is, those are the types
with a
of
plan
theories
for every single person, right?
Yeah.
But that aside, it's undeniable that there is an organizing principle on some level going on here that I don't know that we'll ever fully be able to comprehend, but is certainly true nonetheless.
Right. Yeah.
What that is,
whatever's true is true.
Right. Well, you're somebody who has been a meditator for a long time, and I know your entry point to that started with migraines, right? Which is something my wife deals with and has dealt with. She was just recently, the last 2 days, like down and out. Just tried everything. It's been a real challenge for her.
Yeah, it's awful.
But that's originally, if I'm not mistaken, what kind of brought you into that world.
Yeah. So when I was young, I was about 8 years old when I first started getting migraines. And there was a moment at which I was experiencing a particularly bad one, where I'm sure this happens to your wife too. It's the strangest thing where you're in so much pain, and it's actually a migraine is kind of hard to even pinpoint where the pain is. But any tiny little movement, like just taking a big breath or adjusting myself, would be like this crash to my head. And so I had to stay incredibly still. And I guess because I was so focused on like all of these little micro movements and just, I think when you're in that much pain, and I know other people have had this experience, just the slightest adjustment in one way or the other can make a huge difference. So it can bring you just a little bit of relief. It feels like a lot in that circumstance, in the same way that the movement that makes it more painful does. So I was aware of that, and I think as I was staying really still, I was able to notice that just the psychological state I was in, that I had gotten myself into, or maybe that's not a fair way to describe it, but I realized that I was kind of like fighting the pain. It's hard to describe, but with my psychological stance, right? Yeah. Like my way of kind of looking at the pain or being with the pain was with a lot of resistance and like wanting it to go away, although that's not the right way to describe it. It wasn't with words. It
willfulness.
Felt like,
right.
It almost felt like a movement, right? And so I just decided in that moment, I don't know why, but I just decided to stop doing that and to just get curious about what I was experiencing and to kind of get closer to just really let it be there and really kind of almost like facing your fear. Like, let's just get into this. Like, what is this? And that was kind of the first moment for me of noticing that curiosity could be helpful and kind of be an antidote to different types of pain, which is, I think, part of a realization that comes through meditation also, but more specifically just not resisting something, and kind of having a stance of being curious and letting things be. Even when you're in terrible pain, it creates just the slightest bit of relief. And that was a powerful insight for me that I then, when I was able to, or when it occurred to me, I was able to apply to other areas of my life, not just physical pain, but psychological pain too, to just getting curious about what is this thing that I'm resisting made it a little more tolerable.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's something that Judd Brewer was talking about the other day here, like using, like his work is really in cravings and addiction and using mindfulness techniques.
It's a kind of pain.
And the idea of like letting go of your, willful impulse to try to combat this and releasing your self-judgment and all the emotions that swirl around it and just being curious, being present with it, being curious about what it is. And when you approach it from that perspective, it's almost like it's like it dissolves the solid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think that I hadn't thought about it in that context, but it must be a great tool because it gets you to see thoughts and even sensations like pain as almost as energy, right? It's this thing that is pretty amorphous that when you look at it very closely, craving is a really interesting one. And I actually it's not quite craving, but it's in my meditation practice, the thing if I'm sitting a long retreat, the thing that I now welcome because I think it's so interesting is the desire to move, right?
Right.
Like it's very hard to pinpoint what that feeling is. Like, I know a touch to the hand, I can kind of know what that feeling is pretty clearly, but wanting to move is very hard to find in.
Yeah, it's not localized in any particular place.
And so any kind of like craving or wanting, when you take a closer look at it, I think becomes a kind of, you realize it's a kind of energy.
Yeah, and then it starts to break down.
Yeah.
When you look at it from that perspective.
Yeah.
Talk to me about the work that you do with kids in meditation.
So I've been teaching meditation to children for close to 15 years, I think. I've stopped counting, but I think it's about 15 years. Ever since I discovered Susan Kaiser Greenland's work, which I think is truly brilliant and unlike any of the other work that has been done with children, although there's a lot of great stuff out there now. She created a secular program for children in schools based on the Vipassana teachings, but truly turned it into a completely secular program. And I had just finished a meditation retreat where I kept thinking about how beneficial it would have been for me to learn to meditate as a child, and how I was kind of naturally inclined, as I think a lot of, I noticed this in my classes, so I think it's like any other ability or talent where most people can learn it, but some people are like truly gifted at it. And can learn it much more easily. And I think actually in general, I think children can learn to meditate more easily than adults. But then there are the ones who really take to it pretty quickly and just fall into it right away. And then they can derive all of this benefit from it when they're young. So I came out of that retreat mostly wondering why we don't teach this to children. And thinking about it in the context of physical education, that, like we consider this to be mandatory, like we have to keep our bodies healthy. And this is such an incredibly powerful tool for keeping our minds healthy. Like how different things would be.
Let's wait until everybody accumulates all sorts of baggage and trauma.
And can barely learn how to meditate.
And it's completely closed off to the idea. The openness, the open-mindedness of children seems to be, perfectly suited for, because they're not like, they want to be in that place of awe and wonder and exploration.
Well, and they're in that place all the time. It's like my daughter asking if she's breathing the sky and like why her breath isn't blue, and it's all mysterious, and there's no idea that it should be one way versus another way, and so much of that is an obstacle to learning how to meditate when you don't know what a self is or what free will is or what you're just very open to the next experience.
How many of the kids that you teach end up adopting like a consistent practice?
Oh, I wish I knew. That's a great question.
How does that work?
It's all over the place, I'm sure. I've heard from many parents. I get these wonderful emails and sometimes photo. I actually got this text a couple of years ago from a mom who said we couldn't find, I'll use a different name, Rebecca. We couldn't find Rebecca. We were visiting my parents. We couldn't find Rebecca. We were looking all over the place. And then I found her, and she showed me the picture, and she's sitting meditating under a tree in the backyard.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it's the most wonderful thing about it is that what I was hoping was true is true, that she clearly was deriving so much benefit from it. This is something she wanted to do on her own. She just decided to go do it in a moment that she felt like she wanted to or needed to or whatever.
How does it work with your own kids?
Much harder.
Tell me about it.
Yeah. I keep thinking I need someone else to record all of my guided meditations for my kids.
I don't want to hear it from you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so all of my meditations and lessons are now on the Waking Up app, and I have a long page, and it's maybe slightly intimidating because there's so much text, but I put everything in there that I think is actually really important to know before you teach kids how to meditate. And I'm forgetting. And one of the points I make there is that it's really important to not force kids, to not really to not put pressure on them at all to do it or to learn it. And that I think the best thing that parents can do is model it for their children, which is true of so many things. And my kids, especially my older daughter, she's 10, is definitely interested. And I got very lucky, actually. They invited me to teach a meditation class at her elementary school. So I taught her class kindergarten first for 3 years through second grade. And, that's not advice I can give to, to other parents. Yeah. So it just kind of stops there. But what's interesting is I think children really learn meditation better in the context of a group or a school or a learning setting. And I think at home, you really just have to offer it and talk to them about it so they know it's something that's available and show them how it helps you. And I actually think it's important to do it in front of them. I think they become interested without telling them they have to do it. Just actually sit down and set a timer. And the parents I know who meditate, who have kids who meditate, that's how it's happened.
Works. Yeah. I mean, it's like any good behavior that you want to instill in your kid. If you create restrictions and mandatory rules around it, that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. I mean, it can go both ways, but meditation is definitely that way because it's totally an internal experience. So you can't, you can tell them to say thank you to someone when they've given them something, but meditating, you can't control. It's like you can't force someone to go to sleep, right? Like that's just not something.
Is there an optimal or appropriate age to introduce this?
My favorite age to teach is 9 and 10. And I still generally think that's the best. If there's one time that you're going to introduce it to children, I think that's the time, partly because it stays with them. I think when they learn around 4th grade, those memories stays
with them.
Yeah. And they're also at this really beautiful stage of still being kids, but they're starting to think like adults. And you can have basically every conversation you would have with an adult about meditation with a child that age. And so I think the learning is just very deep. And I think they learn as well as younger children. But I am always proven wrong when I think a group of children are too young and I'm invited to try to teach them. Now the youngest I've taught is 4.5, and they absolutely learned. And it's different. That's cool. Each age is different.
Yeah.
And I would say not every child in that class was meditating for sure. Maybe 4 or 5 of them got it, and a couple had some really interesting experiences. So I think they can learn as young as 4. I think it depends on the context.
Yeah, I heard
it depends on how they're learning.
Speak about that and just the epiphany that one young child had about what the present moment is.
Yeah.
Like that in and of itself, if nothing else.
Yeah, no, that's so often the epiphany, and it's so I love it. It's so interesting to hear them talk about it. But yeah, this was a little boy. I think he's 5, or was 5 at the time. And yeah, he barely had the language to describe what he was talking about, but it was similar to what the girl in 2nd grade who I mentioned in my book. It's a similar realization, and he talked about it in terms of it going fast. He said it just keeps going. I don't even remember exactly what he said, but it was something about it moving fast, which was one of the first realizations I had when I really got when I was able to concentrate for long enough to kind of stay moment to moment for a significant period of time, there's something kind of energizing about it, because it's a good way to describe it. It's moving fast.
We should be teaching this in schools.
We should be teaching it in schools.
Well,
and more and more schools are.
We need to institutionalize this.
I know that, yeah.
So
I think we might be headed there.
Yeah.
I was not optimistic about that just 5-10 years ago. And now I actually think we're headed there. So cool. I now have the opposite concern, which is it's happening too fast, and I don't want programs that aren't
vetted and legit.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, we gotta land this plane, but perhaps leave us with. All right, so we've challenged all our intuitions about consciousness. Like, where does this leave us? Like, I finished the book and I'm like, okay, I don't know. Now I'm like, I learned a lot,
the rest of
but
your
I'm
life
confused.
in awe.
Yeah, what do we? You're asking questions, right? So what do we do with these threads that we're pulling on in terms of how they can inform how we live our life day to day?
Yeah. I'm not sure I have the
know.
greatest answer for that.
I guess I'm not expecting you to. But.
Yeah, no, luckily we now have this research actually that shows that being in a state of awe is actually very good for us. And we kind of can feel that. We know that it feels good. But it increases our well-being to think about these things and to contemplate mysteries and the bigger questions. And so I think if anything, there's that. There's that, if you enjoy wondering about these things, keep doing it.
Yeah. And if you think you know what's going on, think again. Right? I love the book. It's great. The subtitle is A Brief Guide to the Fundamental Mystery of the Mind. It is brief. It's a small book, but don't be confused. This is a very dense, but you got to take your time. You're not going to rifle through this. You could read it in a short period of time, but the concepts themselves are very deep, and they're asking you to think deeply about them, which is great. So congratulations. I loved it.
Yeah.
Good. How do you feel? You feel all right?
Yeah.
Good. We did it.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. If you want to connect with Annaka, where are the best ways for people to
Probably my website is the best. It's just annakaharris.com, but it's ANNAKA Harris.com.
And are you doing any public events or speaking or any of that kind of stuff?
Very little.
Yeah. Okay.
Nothing to announce now. Although I do announce everything that's coming up on social media. So.
All right, good. Yeah. And if you have children and you're interested in exploring meditation with them, the Waking Up app. You can find all of Annaka's programs there.
Yes, and some of my guided meditations are on my website also.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks.
Peace. Bless.